I heard the wind slipping through the pines behind the house. Then a familiar voice called out from the porch. "Mom, open the door. I just need you to sign one more time." I stood still, my hand resting on the latch. The porch light cast a trembling glow on the wall. Trembling, just like me. "You'll be fine if you start with the truth, Ryan." Silence outside. Then came a rough sigh and the words I'll never forget. "Mom, I'm lost." I tightened my grip on the latch. "Then start finding yourself, son, not your mother's money." His footsteps faded away. The keys hanging on the wall clinked softly. Cling, cling. The next morning, I brewed a cup of mint tea. Sunlight fell on the spot where the keys still hung, quietly shining, as if whispering something. And I realized, maybe we only truly grow up when we dare to take responsibility for our own mistakes. And sometimes, forgiveness isn't about pulling someone back into your arms. It's about standing still and letting them find their own way home. This is my story, the door that could speak. If you've ever had to choose between love and boundaries, stay with me till the end, because I believe this story will touch something very real inside you. Don't forget to subscribe and join me as we walk through stories of family and healing, where every door holds both a wound and a way to mend it. Morning slipped through the kitchen window, and the first beam of sunlight touched the amber-colored wooden table. I stood there, hanging the back door key on the old wooden hook. That habit began after Edward passed, a small ritual meant for no one but myself, a reminder that I still have a choice. The choice to open the door or to keep it closed. The choice to decide who's allowed to step into the small world that's left of mine. Steam rose from the mint tea kettle, thin as smoke. Its gentle scent brought me back to the afternoons when he was still here. The two of us sitting on the porch, talking about nothing in particular, as if time itself could be slowed by a single cup of tea. Now, it's just me, Susan, and the rhythm that repeats. Turn on the kettle, pour the water, place the cup exactly where it's always been. Some people call that loneliness. I call it breathing. When Edward left, the house became a place full of empty spaces. At first, I hated the silence. It clung to the walls, slipped through the curtains, rested in my palm every time I held a spoon. But over the years, silence, once my enemy, became my companion. It no longer frightened me with the echo of my own voice. It simply sat there, quietly, like a well-mannered friend who knows when to stay. On the wall, the clock ticked with steady precision, not fast, not slow. Just enough to remind me the day was still moving. Outside, the wind swept through the garden, turning over dry leaves along the path. It sounded like a whisper, as if someone had come back to check whether I was doing all right. I smiled. Maybe it was Edward, or maybe just me, comforting myself. The phone rang, cutting through the calm. On the screen, a familiar name, Ryan. "Mom, I'll stop by tonight. There's something we need to talk about." His voice was firm, a little rushed, with something hidden underneath. Before I could reply, the line went dead. I sat down, watching the steam curl above my tea. A thought crossed my mind. Something to talk about has never meant "I miss you, Mom." By now, I know what that phrase really means. Planned visits from Ryan rarely come with hugs or dinners like they used to. At this age, I've learned how children soften their words to carry heavier meanings. Something to talk about means, "Mom, I need help." I turned the key on the hook gently, listening to the faint metallic click, a quiet omen. In this little house, everything speaks its own language. The sound of boiling water, the wind, the ticking clock, even the soft clink of metal, all hinting at what's yet to be said. The tea cooled. I cupped my hands around it. The warmth pressed softly against my skin, steady as a heartbeat. Maybe I should start dinner, bake an apple pie like I always do when Ryan visits. But this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to make things feel normal. Because somewhere inside, something had shifted, faintly, yet clearly, like sunlight retreating from the wooden floor. I stood up, opened the back door, and looked out toward the garden, where the leaves swirled in circles. The autumn breeze carried the faint scent of sea salt from afar. A new day had begun, but I already knew tonight wouldn't be one of our quiet dinners anymore. A moment later, the phone buzzed softly. A message from Emily. "I'm coming with him." Just 3 words, yet they made my chest tighten. I typed, "Okay," without thinking, a reflex more than a choice, then sat still, watching the screen fade to black. A trace of worry settled in, not because of Emily, she'd never given me a reason to fear her, but because of the silence behind those words. When someone says they're coming with, it usually means one of 2 things. Someone needs protection or courage. I stood up, found the old kitchen cloth, and began wiping the wooden table. Each slow stroke steadied my heartbeat. The dark, worn surface caught the light just enough for the small scratches to gleam faintly. I remembered Edward once saying, "Old things have memories. Touch them and you'll feel what still lives inside." Noon sunlight slid across the floor, laying a warm golden ribbon over the tiles. In that moment, I sensed a fragile kind of peace, beautiful yet so thin that the slightest movement could break it. Maybe I've grown used to living with moments like that, enough to feel safe for a while, but never enough to believe they'll last. On the counter, my cup of mint tea was still warm. I set it down, and the key hanging on the hook made a faint click. Such a small sound, but clear enough to make me look up. Small, yet it touched something deep. For some reason, it brought back an old memory, the afternoons when Ryan was little, holding the keyring in both hands, shaking it like a toy. "Which one opens our house, Mom?" he'd ask, and I used to tell him, "All of them, if you use them with kindness." I smiled faintly. That line feels extravagant now. Over the years, the keys in this house have become less about unlocking doors and more about testing the limits of trust. Outside, the wind shifted. Leaves brushed against each other, dry but familiar. I reached over to close the window, keeping the chill out. The air inside carried a trace of metal and mint. I inhaled deeply. That scent was soothing, yet it also carried a whisper that something was about to change. My eyes wandered around the kitchen. Edward's photo still hung there, the wooden frame slightly tilted, his gaze soft but questioning. "You all right?" I answered quietly. "I'm fine, but not for much longer." Afternoon settled slowly. The light in the house turned from gold to silver, like the fading breath of a day coming to rest. From afar came the sound of a car, then silence. They must be close. I set 3 plates on the table, not knowing why I still did it. Maybe because I wanted to hold on to that small hope, a dinner without tension, where everyone could just eat and smile. My fingers brushed the key again, not out of fear this time, but as a reminder. This is my home, my life, and I have the right to keep or to let go. When the clock struck 5, the kitchen filled with the soft orange glow of dusk. I sat down, my hand resting beside the cup of cooled tea, watching the steam disappear into the air. Everything seemed poised for something. Good or bad, I couldn't tell. But one thing I knew for sure. When the knock finally came, I would open the door. Not out of duty, but because I was ready to face whatever waited outside. Dinner began in the scent of freshly baked apple pie and the soft clinking of forks against plates. Ryan arrived right on time, white shirt pressed, his father's old watch still on his wrist. Emily followed, holding a small bouquet of daisies. They greeted me with polite smiles, The kind reserved for evenings when everyone knows what's about to be said won't be easy to hear. I poured the tea. Steam rose, clouding my view for a moment. When it cleared, Ryan placed an envelope in the middle of the table. "Mom, I just need your signature. It's just a small guarantee." His voice was calm, practiced, but his eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on the edge of the table where the light stretched into a thin golden line. I touched the envelope, feeling the thickness of the paper, something hard inside, maybe a document, a contract. "For whom am I signing, Ryan?" I asked, keeping my tone even, almost gentle. "For me, Mom. Just one signature. It's nothing. I'll pay it back soon." I stayed quiet, my finger tracing the edge of the paper. Inside, the numbers were bold. $150,000. 6 cold digits. There was nothing small about that. Part of me wanted to laugh, but the rest of me only felt my heart tighten. My hands slowed on the edge of the envelope, not because I couldn't read, but because I needed time to listen to what wasn't being said. Something in Ryan's eyes had changed. He wasn't the boy who once asked me to sign a handmade card for his father's wedding anniversary. He was a man now, asking for a signature that could cost me the very house I sat in. Emily's fingers twisted the corner of her napkin, a small gesture, but enough to tell me she knew. She didn't speak, didn't intervene. She just kept her head low, staring at her empty plate. In the kitchen, the ticking clock sounded louder than usual, as if each beat was counting down to the moment I'd have to answer. I opened the envelope a little more. The words "personal guarantee" glared back at me, my name printed clearly at the bottom. No misspellings, no lies on paper. The deceit was in the tone. The way people ask for something terrible with a voice soft enough to sound harmless. "This is a business loan?" I asked quietly. Ryan nodded, taking a sip of water. "A new project, Mom. I just need you to co-sign. The bank wants someone with clean credit. I promise." "Don't promise," I interrupted, soft but sharp enough to stop him. Emily's silence grew heavier than any word in the room. She didn't defend him, didn't look at me. She was balancing between two worlds, the man she chose and the woman she respected. I set the envelope down, my fingers resting on the lid of my teacup. The warmth of the porcelain trembled against my skin. "Let me read it carefully first," I said. Ryan sighed. "Mom, I need it tonight. The deadline's tomorrow morning." And for a brief moment, I saw him as the little boy he once was, hair tousled, rushing home because he'd forgotten to get my signature on a field trip form. I signed without reading then, but now, sitting across from this grown man, I understood. Some signatures, if written too quickly, can erase an entire life. I looked toward the small kitchen window behind the table. The sky had darkened. The last streaks of light slipped away from the glass. And in that dim glow, I saw it again. The back door key, hanging silently on its old wooden hook. The only thing in this house still wholly mine. I suddenly remembered the day I gave Ryan $200 for his first job. He was standing in the kitchen, the smell of toast and the chatter of the radio filling the air, while I counted worn $20 bills from my wallet. He'd said, "Mom, I'll never forget what you've done for me." And I believed him, believed with all the fragile pride of a young widow who thought that if she just loved enough, her son would always find his way back home. Now, under the dim yellow light, that memory returned like the scent of old ink, sweet but fading, with a trace of bitterness when you breathe it in too deeply. I turned the envelope slowly, as if by staring at it long enough, I could see the boy who once kissed my hand before leaving for school. But instead, before me sat a 38-year-old man, leaning back in his chair, His eyes caught somewhere between confidence and desperation. "I need to read this carefully," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I'll make it right by tomorrow," he insisted, as if urgency could stand in for trust. I knew he was afraid. And I also knew that fear had taught him how to lie. Not with malice, but with tenderness. Sometimes people don't tell falsehoods. They just choose the version of truth that hurts less. Emily touched her glass gently, as if to stop something from spilling. She stayed silent, but I could see her breathing tremble. In that moment, I felt more compassion for her than anger toward anyone else. A woman caught between two loyalties never has enough room to breathe. I folded the envelope carefully, the way one folds a letter they'd rather not finish reading. Each crease felt like an effort to keep my heart from breaking. I took a slow breath, letting the scent of mint tea cool the pulse in my throat. Silence settled over the table. No one spoke. Only the faint clink of cutlery, then even that stopped. Outside the window, the streetlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns on the table like an old, faded map. I looked down at my cup of tea. The steam had vanished, leaving only a pale ring. Beside it, Ryan's hand rested on his knee, his thumb tapping lightly, a habit he'd always had when trying to hide the truth. "Finally," I said, "I'll review the papers tomorrow." No promise, no softening. Ryan nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was endurance. Emily rose quietly, carried the pie plates to the sink. I almost told her to leave them, but stopped myself. Some words, if spoken, only make people cry. When they left, the door closed softly, leaving behind the faint smell of cold coffee. I sat down, touched the spot where the envelope had been. The wood felt cool beneath my fingers, the chill of a negotiation written in blood ties. On the wall, Edward's old clock ticked steadily, each beat echoing a question I wasn't ready to answer. "Does love have limits, Susan?" I looked toward the back door key. It still hung there, silent, a witness to every choice ever made in this house. And I knew, the next time I touched it, nothing would be the same again. After dinner, Ryan stood up. "I'm going outside to call my partner," he said, his voice steady, measured, as if he had already rehearsed his exit. I only nodded. He grabbed his coat, took out his phone, and walked out. The sound of the car door closing folded into the wind, short, cold, deliberate. Then the engine faded into the distance until there was nothing left but silence. Outside, leaves kept falling on the gravel path. Inside, the clock ticked on, steady, indifferent, as if nothing had happened. I turned toward the dining table. The envelope still lay there among the crumbs of apple pie. Under the yellow light, its edges glowed pale, like something forgotten, yet still heavy with meaning. Emily stood by the sink, sleeves rolled up. Water ran softly, soap bubbles rising and bursting like a quiet rainstorm indoors. I picked up a plate and joined her. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Steam blurred our faces until she finally whispered, "Please, don't sign it." Her voice was small, the final word trembling, as if one more word of kindness would make her cry. I looked at her. Gone was the confident young woman I'd known. In her place stood someone with wet hands and eyes torn between loyalty and conscience. "You know something, don't you?" I asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "He's in debt. It's not a new project. It's an old one." Her lips pressed together, shoulders shaking slightly. Then came a whisper. "He's afraid of disappointing you." I set the plate down and dried my hands. "Whose debt?" I asked, no pretense left. Her eyes lifted to mine, red, wet, unguarded. His. The word fell like a small stone into water, sending ripples that never stopped expanding. I said nothing, leaning gently against the counter while my heart sank one quiet beat lower. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was knowing something inside had cracked, not love, but trust. I looked at her, this young woman holding back tears, and felt more tenderness than anger. At her age, she was already watching the man she loved dig a hole deep enough for them both to fear falling in. The water kept running. I wiped the sink edge, steadying my hands. Emily spoke again. He thought if you knew the truth, you wouldn't help, so he hid it. I let out a small, weary laugh, not out of humor, but because I recognized the pattern. Men in this house, Edward, then Ryan, they all shared the same fear. They dreaded my disappointment more than being wrong. The kitchen light reflected on the window. Outside, darkness had settled, touching the last faint streaks of gold on the table. I glanced at the back door key still hanging on its hook. Once a symbol of peace, now it felt unbearably heavy. I turned to Emily. You know, I said, silence is its own kind of lie. She nodded, tears spilling at last. I'm sorry, Mrs. Susan. I placed a hand on her shoulder, not to comfort, but to let her know I understood. The sound of running water filled the small house, soft enough to hide the weight of our truths, and I realized, tonight, only two women remained, one who knew the truth, and one who no longer wished to run from it. I walked to the hook and set the key on the counter. The faint click of metal against wood shifted the air in the room, almost imperceptibly, but real. My hand trembled, not from fear, but because everything that had once felt uncertain was now coming into focus. For years, I believed peace could be kept by keeping the house clean, the table full, and the door always open. But peace doesn't live in open doors. It lives in honesty. I looked at the key, once a symbol of love, now a witness, asking, this time, who will you choose? Your son or yourself? Behind me, Emily was still standing by the sink. The light caught her hair, casting a faint halo around her head. The water kept falling, as if the house itself was trying to hide the conversation yet to come. She whispered, You're afraid he'll hate you. Her voice was barely air, but it struck something deep within me. I turned to her, held her gaze for a long moment. She was young, and in her eyes I saw myself, the woman I used to be, always afraid to disappoint, always mistaking endurance for love. Then I said, slowly, each word deliberate, he can hate me, but I won't lose myself. The words slipped out, not loud, but firm enough to still the air. Even the sound of running water seemed to pause. I'd never imagined saying something like that, at least not to anyone other than myself. But once I did, the weight lifted. It felt like stepping out of a long, darkened room without needing to turn on the light. Emily looked up at me, her eyes a mix of fear and reverence. I knew those words would stay with her far longer than any advice ever could. Perhaps it was the first time she'd seen a mother choose self-respect over mercy. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping across the porch. Leaves brushed against the walls, sounding almost like someone knocking. I turned and quietly closed the back door, a small gesture, but a clear one. Tonight, I wasn't waiting for anyone. Back at the table, my cup of tea had long gone cold. The steam was gone, leaving only the faint, sharp scent of mint in the air. I lifted the cup, then set it back down. The soft clink of porcelain against wood rang through the room, not as background noise, but as a period at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. The house changed tone. It was no longer a place that held silence for lies. It began to speak in truth. The clock still ticked, but its rhythm felt lighter. The wind through the cracks sounded almost kind, as if reminding me that when truth is finally spoken, even the walls know how to breathe again. Emily folded the dish towel and placed it by the sink. Her voice was hoarse when she asked, "What will you do now?" I didn't answer right away. My eyes drifted to the key on the counter, its metal catching a pale glint of light. Cold, but clear. "I don't know yet," I said at last, "but this time I won't stay silent." We stood there, two women, one learning how to guard her own heart, the other learning how to tell the truth. And in that small kitchen, amid the scent of soap and stale tea, I realized this was the calmest peace I had ever known. Night fell, and the house sank into silence. Only the ticking clock and the soft breath of wind on the porch remained. I sat in the kitchen, opened my laptop, and my hands trembled slightly as I typed the bank password. The screen flickered to life, its cold blue light carving the lines on my cheeks even deeper. I've never been afraid of technology, only of what it might reveal. The truth. The cursor blinked before the list of transactions. Then the lines appeared, neat, emotionless. Withdrawals, transfers, online payments, all under the name S. Miller. My name. I zoomed in on the digital signature. The stroke was smooth, clean, precise. So perfect it almost fooled me. But I never signed it, not once. A chill slipped through the crack in the door, as though someone had opened a hidden passage to let suspicion walk right in. "When did I ever agree to this?" I whispered, but the question fell into emptiness. No answer came, only the patient blinking of the cursor as if it were waiting for me to decide what to believe. I scrolled down. One loan, 2 credit card payments, several transfers to a company account I didn't recognize. Each one signed S. Miller. Each one marked verified. I froze, my heartbeat stumbled. Something was breaking. Not money, but the thin, final line between trust and betrayal. I searched my emails and messages. Nothing. No warnings, no confirmations. Everything had moved seamlessly, as if I had opened the door myself. Fear, anger, and emptiness tangled inside me. I touched the letters of my name on the screen, then pulled my hand back, as if from hot metal. Outside, rain began to fall softly. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the glow of the screen spilling across the wall. In the reflection on the laptop glass, I saw a stranger, a woman whose eyes held both exhaustion and a new kind of clarity. The night stretched on. I didn't sleep. Numbers circled endlessly in my head. Dates, amounts, bank names, nothing felt steady anymore. At dawn, when the first light touched the curtain, I heard a faint knock at the door. It was Emily. She stood there, coat wrapped tight, a stack of papers in her hands. Her eyes avoided mine. "I think you should see this," she said, placing the papers on the table. Thick white pages with pale blue borders. I opened them. Every transaction, every amount, every forged signature, all laid bare. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He used your name. I'm sorry." The words fell between us like a drop of water on glass, clear, and instantly shattered. I looked at the papers, then at the young woman struggling to stay composed. Morning light slanted through the window, resting on her shoulder. There was nothing left to say. Everything I had feared in the dark was now, at last, the truth. On the wall hook, the back door key still caught the morning light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Yet in its silence I could hear something unmistakable. The line had been crossed. I walked to the kitchen and set water to boil. The kettle hissed faster than usual, steam rising, as if it were trying to speak the words I couldn't. When I poured the tea, it overflowed without my noticing, running down the side of the cup, seeping into the grain of the wood, burning the edge of my finger. Still, I stood there watching it spread, a quiet spill that felt like shock itself, wordless, unstoppable. Before, when people spoke of financial fraud, I always thought of it as something distant, something that happened to others, careless people, overly trusting ones. Now I understood. Sometimes the person who takes from you isn't a stranger at all, but the one you once gave everything to. Emily sat across from me, holding the stack of printed pages tightly. "I called the bank," she said. "They'll reach out this morning." I nodded but didn't look at her. All I could hear was one number repeating in my mind: $150,000. It wasn't money anymore. It was the boundary itself. An hour later, the house phone rang. The man on the line spoke in a polite, professional tone. "Mrs. Miller, we've reviewed the activity. There are signs of unauthorized use of your personal information. We'll temporarily freeze the suspicious accounts." I inhaled deeply, listening to my own heartbeat, slow, deliberate, as if counting every time I'd ignored my instincts before. He continued, careful but firm. "We recommend filing a fraud report and activating a credit alert. It will prevent further withdrawals under your name. We'll need your signature on some documents." Outside the window, daylight had faded from warm gold to pale silver, as though even the sun understood what had changed. "I understand," I said. "I'll come in." When I set the phone down, my knees felt weak. Emily caught my arm. "Are you all right?" she asked. I gave a small, dry smile. All right is a very large word. By noon, we were at the bank. The line was long. The air smelled of paper, ink, and cold air conditioning. I took the file the clerk handed me. Small black letters, clinical, impersonal. But this time, they were on my side. The clerk, a young woman, read the statement aloud, her voice steady. "Mrs. Miller confirms that this electronic signature is not hers. The bank has frozen the account and filed reports with the legal and credit departments." My hand trembled as I signed. The ink bled slightly into the paper, softening the curve of the final letter. I looked at my signature, imperfect, unlike the forged one I'd seen on the screen last night. But this one was real. It was mine. When she nodded and closed the file, I felt something shift inside me. Not quite relief, but a quiet strength, the kind I thought I'd lost with age. For the first time, the law stood beside me, not as a wall of procedure, but as a hand on my shoulder, wordlessly assuring me I wasn't alone. On the drive home, Emily kept her eyes on the road while I watched the city slide past. Storefronts, crosswalks, buses, people moving as if nothing in the world had changed. I thought of Ryan, of how he would react when he learned I had called the bank. Maybe anger, maybe fear, maybe silence. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let fear define me anymore. Back home, I took off my coat, hung it by the door, and stood before the key on the wall. It was still there, silent, cool, but shining brighter in the afternoon light. I touched it gently, careful not to let it make a sound. This time I didn't need the noise to know everything had changed. The next afternoon, just as I finished watering the chrysanthemums on the porch, I heard a familiar car stop at the gate. I didn't need to look. Ryan walked in, his shirt half-buttoned, tie askew. He didn't knock. My son never knocked. "Just this once, Mom." Those were his first words, spoken before any greeting. He sat down, eyes fixed on the floorboards, the tone of someone forgiven too many times, who now believes mercy is a given. I wiped my hands on the towel and stood still. The phrase echoed in my head like the ticking of the clock. This once. And this once always meant once more. I didn't ask for what, because I already knew. The debt, the forged signature, all of it wore my son's face. I only asked, "Did you come to apologize, or to ask for more?" Ryan said nothing. A strained smile crossed his lips, brief and tired. "Mom, I know I messed up, but it's done. If you help me this time, I promise." "Don't promise." My voice was quiet but sharp. He looked up. His eyes darkened. There was something in them, part son, part stranger, shame and anger, pleading and pride, the mix of a man who's gone too far but isn't ready to turn back. "I don't understand why you did it," he said. "You froze the account, called the bank, made them suspect me. You embarrassed me." "No one embarrassed you, Ryan," I said evenly. "You did that yourself." He sighed, leaned back, pressed his palms against his forehead. "You're always so cold. I did everything for you. Don't you see that? You think I wanted things to end up like this?" His voice rose, but I stayed silent. Inside, only stillness. Then he changed his tone, the way people do when they remember where your soft spots are. He began to speak of gratitude, of loneliness, of fear. "I just don't want you to be alone," he said. "After Dad died, I'm all you have left. I just want you to feel safe. I'm trying to take care of you." I listened, slowly, to every word. Like hearing an old song I once loved, but now found exhausting. Affection can become a noose. Every "I just want you to be safe" pulled tighter. Soft, but suffocating. Like silk, binding the wrists. That was when I realized something was wrong with this kind of love. Not because it was too little, but because it was too much. Too much control. Too much fear. Too little respect. Love used as restraint isn't love at all. It's a velvet chain. I walked to the table and poured tea. My hand was steady, though my chest ached. "Ryan," I said, "when you were small and afraid of the dark, I turned on the light for you. But I never taught you that fear gives you the right to take someone else's light." He pressed his lips together and said nothing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. In the small kitchen, the scent of mint tea drifted through the air. I looked at my son, the man I had given life to, raised, and now had to protect myself from. No one spoke. Only the clock on the wall ticked, slow and deliberate, as if trying to stretch the moment long enough for me to breathe through it. I sat down and opened the folder Ryan had placed before me. The smell of new paper mingled with the faint trace of mint. My son stood there, shoulders hunched, waiting. I looked at the printed lines, then at the face I had known since it fit in the crook of my arm. For a fleeting moment, my heart faltered, that reflex of a mother who wants to believe one more time. But then reason rose up, clear and cutting, like sunlight breaking through fog. I set the pen down and said softly, but with certainty, "I'm clear now. I won't sign." Ryan stood still. My voice was low but steady, sharp enough to split the air between us. He looked at me, eyes red, then turned away quickly. I saw his jaw tighten, his hand curl into a fist. There was no shouting, no outburst of anger, only a heavy disappointment, like something falling quietly inside us both. I didn't ask him to understand. I only wished he would stop, just for a second. But Ryan didn't stop. "Do you really think I meant to do this?" he said. "You used to say you'd always believe in me." "Believing," I answered, "doesn't mean being blind. And loving doesn't mean paying the price for someone else's choices." He let out a bitter laugh, the kind that belongs to someone who suddenly feels the whole world has turned against him. "I'm just asking for one signature. Just one." I didn't respond. I listened instead. To the wind against the door, to the steady ticking of the clock, the quiet reminders that time would prove what words could not. Behind me, Emily stood still. She didn't speak, didn't take sides. Her silence was a kind of strength, soft but sure. I could feel her breathing slow, gathering all her courage not to cry. Ryan looked toward his wife, searching for an ally, but she lowered her head. Between them stretched a silence that no amount of money could ever fill. "I thought at least she'd understand," he said hoarsely. "You're both against me." I shook my head. "No one's against you. We're stopping before there's nothing left to save." He opened his mouth to reply, but the words never came. Instead, he drew in a long breath and turned away, His sleeve brushed the edge of the table, making the cold teacup tremble. He walked quickly to the door. The back door closed softly behind him. The sound was small, but it lingered for a long time. Only the scent of stale coffee remained in the kitchen, bitter, slow, seeping into the wood like the aftertaste of an argument no one dared to name. I sat down, staring at the space where Ryan had stood. The house was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that lets you know a boundary has been crossed. Emily came closer and laid a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," she whispered. I didn't answer. My eyes drifted to the back door key hanging on its hook, glinting softly under the light, steady and calm, as if to remind me that love should never be mistaken for a chain. I poured more water into my cup. Steam rose and slowly faded into the air. Maybe this was the moment I finally chose to stand with myself. Not because I had stopped loving him, but because I had learned that one more signature might have meant signing away who I was. Night pressed down, thick as a heavy blanket. I had just drifted into sleep when the phone split through the dark like a flare. The blue light on the screen burned my eyes. Across the black background, one word glowed in harsh electric letters. Ryan. His name shone like a cut, cold, bright, and sharp. I hesitated for a few seconds. Outside, the wind pushed against the window. The curtain moved like a nervous heartbeat. Then I answered. "Mom, the deadline's in the morning. I'm screwed." His voice was frantic, half anger, half desperation. And behind it came chaos, the sound of traffic, his ragged breathing, maybe even bottles clinking together. "Ryan, where are you?" I asked. "It doesn't matter. You have to unfreeze the account. Call the bank. They're holding my money, Mom. Do you understand?" "That's not your money," I said quietly. "God, you're always like this. Stubborn, cold, always so damn right about everything." His voice hit like a wave, crashing into my ear, into the walls, into my chest. I could hear every breath, sharp and broken, the sound of someone drowning in his own fear. I wanted to say something gentle, but my throat was dry. The only words that came out were bare. "You need to calm down." "Calm down?" he snapped, laughing bitterly. "You're destroying my life, and you want me calm?" I didn't answer. In the silence, I heard his heavy breathing, then the wind roaring through the line, long, hollow, endless. I stood and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold and thin. The sky hung low, thick with salt from the distant sea. I sat on the wooden step, the phone still against my ear. On the other end, Ryan was still talking, but the words broke apart, scattered, meaning nothing. The wind brushed the keys hanging by the door. Their faint metallic clinking wove into the gusts, fragile, yet enough to remind me that I was still here, in this small house, in this quiet life, a mother who had just lost her son in a different way. I closed my eyes, drawing a deep breath. In it lived pain, love, and a fragment of release. I didn't know where my son was, but I knew I could no longer save him in the same way. "Ryan," I whispered into the phone. "I'm here." There was silence, only his breathing, hoarse and lost. Then the call ended. I stayed where I was. I didn't cry. The night was too deep for tears. Far away, the tide hummed against the shore, keeping pace with the ticking clock inside. Two steady rhythms, one belonging to the world, the other to my heart. I looked at the back door key swaying gently in the wind, moonlight sliding across it like a silver tear. And in that cold, I understood. Love can't save someone who's running from himself. Some calls arrive only to teach us how to be silent, without cruelty. Then, his voice came again in my memory, urgent, breaking, almost pleading. "Mom, just unfreeze it. They said if you don't sign, I lose everything." I closed my eyes. The wind lifted the cloth from the chair. The old pine behind the house groaned in the dark. The same sound that once frightened me, the sound of silence between two people who once loved each other. "I can't," I said slowly, each word deliberate, each one falling like a small stone into the still water of the night. My voice was hoarse but steady, and for the first time, it didn't tremble. On the other end of the line, silence. No cars, no breathing, no sound at all. Just 5 long seconds, long enough for me to hear the clock in the living room marking each passing beat. Then the call dropped. The short tone was cold, final, like a pair of scissors cutting through the last fragile thread between mother and son. I lowered the phone. The screen dimmed and went dark, returning the house to its full, undisturbed night. Outside, the wind circled the porch, carrying the scent of salt, damp earth, and the faint clink of the back door key. I sat down by the door, where a stripe of moonlight stretched across the floor. My hand reached for the teacup I'd left earlier. It was cold now. I held it, the chill of the ceramic seeping through my palms, spreading slowly beneath my skin. For the first time in years, I could feel the shape of pain. It was no longer a wave crashing over me, but something solid, still, heavy, like a stone resting quietly inside. I didn't cry. I just sat there, listening to the rhythm of my own breath. I remembered when Ryan was little. Every time he fell, he would run home, wrap himself around my leg, and say, "I'm okay." I used to believe that as long as a mother was there, a child would always be fine. But now I understood. Some wounds no one else can bandage, not even a mother. The moonlight streamed through the window, painting pale streaks across the floor like traces of water. I looked up and saw the air shimmering around the frame, like faint steam from an invisible cup of tea. At this age, I've learned that not all silences are to be feared. Some silences are boundaries, the heart's way of protecting itself from being torn open again. I leaned my head against the wall, drew in a deep breath, and listened to the wind traveling over the roof. And in that moment, I realized something I had never truly understood as a mother. Sometimes, love means standing still while someone falls, trusting they'll find their own strength to rise, without using you as the cushion. I set the cup down, the chill clinging to my fingers. On the hook, the key trembled softly, letting out a barely audible sound, like an affirmation. I looked at it and smiled, tired but calm. The night was still deep, but I was no longer afraid. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as if nothing had happened the night before. But the chill still lingered, not from the weather, but from the distance between the Millers. I was rinsing a teacup when I heard a car stop at the gate. Emily stepped in, holding a thick folder, her face pale. She placed it on the table, took a deep breath, and sat down. "You need to see this," she said. I dried my hands and opened the folder. Inside were new bank statements, confirmation letters, and printed emails. A secondary account, a fake authorization, each page ending with the same signature, S. Miller. Perfectly forged. I read line by line, date by date. Every piece fit. There was no room left to pretend it was a mistake. Across from me, Emily gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. Her voice shook. "I know he did wrong, but maybe he was just scared. Scared of losing face, scared of your anger, scared of admitting he failed." I said nothing. Morning light bounced off the paper, catching in my eyes until it blurred into water. I realized I was crying. Not with sobs, not with noise, but with a stillness that felt truer than any outburst. It wasn't the money. I could lose money, lose a house, and survive. But this? Losing the one thing I thought could never be stolen, the quiet trust between two people who used to understand each other without words. That was different. Emily stayed silent. She knew not to comfort, not to apologize. The clock ticked above us, each beat falling between two women, one young, one old, both learning how to love again, this time with clear eyes. I closed the folder. In my mind, memories collided. Ryan's laughter as a boy, his proud 10-year-old grin showing me his report card, and the face I saw last night, frightened, dishonest, almost unrecognizable. Something inside me cracked, not to break apart, but to let air in. Emily finally asked, "What will you do?" I looked toward the window. Sunlight glinted on the back door key, the metal shining like a reminder. I drew a breath, my voice calm, almost detached. "I'll wait, to see what he chooses." It was the only answer I could give. No plan, no punishment, no rush to forgive. Just waiting. Waiting to see whether my son would face the truth in himself or keep hiding behind the cold safety of numbers. Emily lowered her head. I could feel her fear, that when the truth fully surfaced, her marriage might not survive it. But in her eyes there was also a spark, small but brave. We sat quietly. Outside, wind slipped through the cracks, and the key gave a faint metallic sound. I turned toward it, my heart settling. Some truths arrive late, but when they come, they don't need to knock. By late afternoon, the sky had turned gray, clouds hanging low over our small street. I was at the kitchen table when a knock came. It was Betty, my neighbor, silver hair, clear eyes, always smelling faintly of soap. She stepped in without her usual small talk, set a basket of cookies on the table, and said plainly, "Emily told me a bit. Keep your papers safe. If you need, I'll drive you to the legal clinic. They've got good people there. They won't charge." I smiled, still tired. "I know. Thank you, Betty." She looked straight at me, her gaze sharp but kind. "Are you going to forgive him?" I didn't answer right away. I poured 2 cups of tea, handed her one, and watched the steam rise. Not forgive. I just want to give him a chance to fix it himself. She nodded slowly. "I get it. But chances can be double-edged, Susan. You need boundaries." "I have them," I said, "and this time I know how to keep them." After she left, I reopened the folder and read through every page, the signatures, the amounts, the evidence of every mistake. I had cried, trembled, and feared, but now I felt steady. Not because things were fixed, but because for the first time I knew I was no longer the one being pulled under. The next morning, I went to the bank, not to plead, but to finish what needed to be done. I carried a small bag with me. Inside were the fraud report, my ID, and a handwritten note that read, "Not everything right needs to end in revenge." When I met the officer handling my case, I said clearly, "I want to file the fraud report, but I'd like to withdraw the request for prosecution, for now." The young woman looked up, surprised. "Are you sure? That means if he continues—" "I know," I interrupted, "but sometimes people need to see how close they are to losing everything before they can learn how to hold on to what's left." I signed my name. The pen trembled slightly, but the line held firm. When the red stamp came down, the sound of it echoed through the white office, a single, final thump. Outside, I lingered by the doors for a while. The air was cold, but sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting against the glass facade. For the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. Back home, I brewed a fresh pot of mint tea and poured it into my old cup. Steam rose, soft and calm, carrying a quiet comfort. Emily stopped by, saying little. We sat across from each other, sharing the silence. She placed her hand gently on the folder beside me and asked, "Are you sure you want to leave it like this?" "Not leave it," I said. "Let it find its own course. If there's still something left of the man I raised, he'll know what he needs to do." On the wall, the back door key hung in its place. Late sunlight slipped through the curtain, striking the metal and setting it aglow. I looked at it for a long moment and smiled. The boundary now had a shape, no longer invisible like endurance, or fragile like old faith. It gleamed instead, not as a wall, but as a thin, bright line, reminding me that I can love without erasing myself. I set the cup down, the soft click of porcelain meeting wood filling the air. In the kitchen, everything sounded ordinary again. The ticking clock, the hum of wind, the faint trace of mint. But deep inside, I knew. A new chapter had begun, one where love was no longer a chain, but a light to guide me forward. The afternoon sky was a pale gray, neither sun nor rain, just that quiet color that feels like a pause. I was wiping the table when I heard the door open. No knock, no greeting, only the familiar click of the hinge, the sound of habit. Ryan stepped inside, jacket slung over his shoulder, his eyes tight, though he tried to look composed. "I still have a key," he said, his tone caught between reproach and familiarity. I replied softly, "The last time you used it was to sign my name, wasn't it?" He stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked up. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us finding a gentle enough place to begin. Then he exhaled, half a sigh, half a smile. "You still keep the back door open for me, though." That line, so simple, almost harmless, struck something inside me. It wasn't a statement, it was a test, a way to see if his mother still had the weakness he could count on. I dried my hands and walked to the wooden hook where the back door key hung quietly. I took it down, walked back, and set it on the table. The door only opens for respect. My voice was low, not loud, but it carried. The sound of metal touching wood was delicate, like the tick of a clock slipping from before into after. Ryan stood motionless, hands still in his pockets. I could see the movement in his throat, the effort to argue, but no words came out. The silence was heavy, not from anger, but from the awareness that this conversation had outgrown the need for many words. I sat down and poured tea, slowly. Steam rose, the scent of mint filling the space, the same scent that had once meant comfort. I slid a second cup across the table toward him. "Sit, we can still talk like two adults." He didn't sit. His shoulders were tense, his pride warring quietly with something deeper. Shame, maybe fear. Then the door opened softly behind him. Emily stepped in. She was still wearing the old gray sweater, her face pale, eyes tired. In her hand was a small envelope. When she saw Ryan, she froze, then drew a steady breath. "I'll keep this short," she said, calm, unnervingly so. "I'll pay my share, but I'm not signing for you anymore." Her voice trembled but didn't break. She set the envelope on the table, right beside the key. Two small objects, heavy with the weight of a family learning how to redraw its boundaries. Ryan stared at her, confusion flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" Emily didn't move. Her fingers laced together, white at the knuckles. "I've done the math," she said. "I'll cover what's ours, the company debts. But what you borrowed on your own, that's yours alone. I won't lose everything in the name of love." I listened quietly, not interrupting. Her voice stretched across the kitchen like a thin thread, soft but strong. And in her, I saw the version of myself from decades ago, before I had learned how to say no. Ryan turned to me, his voice sharp. "Mom, are you hearing this?" I set my teacup down and kept my eyes on the key resting between us. "I hear her," I said. And I think, Ryan, you should too. He laughed, a crooked, joyless sound. So now you're both on the same side? No, I said quietly. We're just learning the same lesson. Outside, the wind struck the porch, rattling the frame of the door. Inside, the kitchen dimmed. The scent of tea hung faintly in the air, dissolving like breath in winter. I knew the conversation wasn't over, but the most important things had already been said. Not in words, but in what we refused to do. The air thickened. Ryan stood tense, fists clenched, his gaze darting from Emily to me, a look caught somewhere between anger and despair. "She turned you against me," he burst out, voice cracking, half fury, half fear. The words landed like glass shattering on the floor, sharp, final, and beyond repair. Emily stepped back, trembling, clutching her sweater. I saw in her eyes something I recognized all too well, the look of a woman backed into a corner where love and guilt blur until neither can breathe. I drew a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. No one turned me against you, Ryan. You're the one fighting the people who love you. He shook his head, laughing under his breath, bitter and breaking. I did everything for you. Don't you see that? The company, the debt. I was trying to protect what Dad left behind. You think I'm the villain here? I looked at my son, the man who once carried all my hope. Something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but the ache of feeling betrayed. But he wasn't asking for truth. He was asking for permission. Permission to keep being wrong without consequence. My voice came out slow, careful, each word a step across ice. I once dreamed you'd grow up to protect someone, not frighten them into signing. The words slipped out from an old wound. They weren't accusation but confession, the kind that comes only after years of silence, because I too had once signed. I too had given in. I had kept quiet when love turned into control, mistaking endurance for devotion. Ryan froze. His eyes darted away, then dimmed. He turned toward Emily, his voice hoarse, fractured. Are you happy now? Even my mother thinks I'm a failure. Emily didn't speak. She just stood there, tears falling soundlessly. He grabbed his coat from the chair. Fine. If that's what you all think, then I'm done. No one stopped him. He strode to the door. The wind rushed in as he opened it, scattering the papers on the table. In that moment, the back door key tapped against the edge, a small, clear sound, like a closing line at the end of a long chapter. He left. The door shut softly behind him. The hinge creaked once, then silence. The kitchen exhaled, quiet again, filled only with the faint salt of sea air and the bitterness of cooled tea. I didn't move. I didn't follow. I didn't cry. I just stood there, hand resting on the key. It was cold but solid. I could feel every groove in the metal, every scratch, the wear of years, the texture of love that had aged but not broken. Emily stayed near the door, her shoulders trembling. I turned to her and said gently, Don't be afraid. He needs to fall before he can stand. Now let the wind clear the house. She nodded, eyes red. I walked back to the table, picked up the key and hung it on its hook. The wood made a soft click, a sound that felt like closure. Outside, the sunset slid down the line of pines, laying a thin veil of light across the porch. I watched it fade, my heart quiet. Maybe this is what strength looks like for a mother. Not holding her child back, but letting him walk out the door, even if it closes behind him. The house had settled into silence. No sound of tires at the gate, no midnight phone calls, no hurried coffee brewing in the kitchen. Only the wind weaving through the pines, and the steady rhythm of the clock, like the house itself was breathing. It was the 10th day of quiet. At first, the stillness made it hard to sleep. It felt like the space after a storm, too clean, too empty, as if even the noise inside me had been washed away. But slowly, I realized this silence was different. Silence had stopped being punishment. It had become company. I began to hear again the small things I'd forgotten. The spoon tapping the rim of a cup, the soft rustle of leaves on the roof, the creak of the wooden door expanding in the damp air. Ordinary sounds, yet each one proof of a new kind of peace. Not perfect, but real. On the 10th morning, I decided to clean the old wardrobe in my bedroom, the one I'd avoided since Edward passed. The door groaned as I opened it, and the thin cloud of dust rose like a sigh from the past. I sorted through the shelves, worn sweaters, yellowed photographs, a bundle of letters tied with string. In the bottom drawer, I found an ivory envelope pressed between fading folders. The handwriting on it was unmistakable, slightly slanted, deliberate, always ending with a small dot after each sentence. It said, "For when you need to be strong." Signed, Edward. I froze, my hand trembling. Outside, the wind slipped through the porch and touched the edge of the envelope, as if urging me to open it. I sat on the bed, took a breath, and carefully peeled it open. Inside were a few neatly folded pages, and on top a small handwritten note, old, but the ink still dark. Edward's handwriting, simple but full of weight. Don't let love turn you into a debtor. If ever you must choose between kindness and freedom, choose freedom. Only the free can love fully. I placed the note on my lap as tears fell, quiet, unannounced. He had written these words years ago, when he was still strong, and I still believed love meant endurance. Back then, I didn't understand, but now, every word felt like a lantern held up to the road I was walking. Slow, lonely, but true. I unfolded the rest of the pages. They were his financial notes, savings accounts, safe investments, the contact of a trusted advisor I'd never called. Everything written clearly, precisely. Edward had always been meticulous, sometimes to the point of irritation. Now, that care felt like a hand reaching back to lift me. Leaning against the headboard, I reread his message. Don't let love turn you into a debtor. It wasn't just about money. It was about how to live, how to love, how to keep oneself intact. A small laugh escaped through my tears. You always knew I'd need to hear this. Just later than I should have, I whispered. In the dusty afternoon light, I felt him near, not close enough to touch, but close enough to remind me I was never truly alone. I folded the papers, slid them back into the old envelope, and placed it in the drawer again. Outside, the light was fading, but inside me, something glowed, a small, steady lamp that had just been lit. I sat for a long time, the note still warm in my hand. Edward's words echoed softly in my mind, not as a lesson, but as a gentle reminder of the freedom I had once traded away in the name of love. And then I laughed, through the tears this time. Better late than never. It had taken me years to learn something so simple, that love isn't always sacrifice, and silence isn't kindness if it erases who you are. The last light of the day slipped through the window, touching the old photograph of Edward and me from our first trip to Cape May. I looked at his smile, calm, warm, the kind that once made me believe I was strong. Maybe if he were still alive, Edward wouldn't be surprised. Maybe he'd simply rest a hand on my shoulder and say, I know, Susan. You've always had the strength. You just needed time to believe in it. I picked up my phone and took a picture of his note. The ink had faded, the paper yellowed, but each letter still seemed to carry his warmth. I opened the chat window and sent the photo to Emily, adding a short message. Let's start over, my dear. A few minutes later, she replied with a heart emoji and a single line. I'm learning too, Susan. Thank you for not giving up on us. I read her message and sat still, letting a quiet smile spread, slow and soft, like the warmth of fresh tea. Outside the window, a car hummed away into the distance, leaving only the wind brushing across the roof. No more arguments, no more midnight calls, no pleading voices, only stillness, and for the first time, stillness didn't feel frightening. I stood and walked to the kitchen. The back door key lay on the table, where the light touched it, shining like a tiny piece of sunlight. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal against my palm. This cold was different from loneliness. It was real, the kind that reminds you of what's endured with you through every opening and closing, every trust and every fracture. I walked to the wooden hook, drew a steady breath, and hung it back up. When the ring met the hook with a soft click, I realized the sound was warm, like a private language, one that finally belonged to me. It was no longer a symbol of fear. Not fear of loss, not fear of being left behind, not fear of being forgotten. Now, it stood for something else entirely. Steadiness, calm, and the quiet knowledge of my own worth. The key swayed gently in the afternoon light, its metallic gleam forming a thin ribbon between past and present. And I saw, more clearly than ever, that boundaries aren't walls to keep people out. They're the fine lines that keep us from losing ourselves. I brewed another cup of tea. Steam rose, mingling with the scent of mint, softening the air around me. On the wall, Edward's photo seemed to smile. I whispered, almost to myself, I understand now, and I won't repeat it again. Outside, the sunset touched the line of pines. Light spilled across the porch, catching the rim of my teacup, sending up a thin curl of steam, fading, warm, alive. I sat down and closed my eyes, listening inward. No apologies left to make, no forgiveness to ask for. Just a woman, after so much loss, who has finally learned how to stay, with herself, in silence, but unbroken. 1 month later. Early winter in New Jersey carried a quiet chill. The pine branches outside were dusted with a thin frost, and the wind whispered through them like someone murmuring words they couldn't quite say aloud. I sat in the kitchen, sipping my morning mint tea, when the phone rang. It was the bank. The woman's voice was familiar, polite, composed, professional. Mrs. Miller, this is to inform you that Mr. Ryan Miller's account has been officially frozen. The bank requires him to provide statements explaining prior transactions. A few clients have also requested to terminate their contracts. I murmured a soft, "Thank you," my fingers tightening around the cup. I wasn't trembling, just cold. The woman continued, brief as if reading a news report. "We'll send you a copy of the documentation for your records. Thank you for your cooperation." The call ended. The house fell silent again. I sat for a long moment, gazing out the window. On the lawn, the last maple leaves drifted down, brushing against each other before touching the ground. I thought of Ryan, my son who had always tried to move faster than the world, but never learned how to stop. The phone buzzed again, this time a message from him. The words appeared one by one, broken, uneven, like his breath. "Mom, they're overreacting. You have to say something. Help me. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. If you don't do something, I'll lose everything. You must be enjoying this. You owe me." The texts came in waves, pleading, blaming, threatening, a full tide of emotion pulling, retreating, pulling again. I read each line slowly, following the rhythm of my son's panic, from fear to anger, from blame to begging. Each message a step deeper into the same old current, the one where the mother saves and the son falls. I didn't reply, not yet. Instead, I set the phone down and brewed another pot of tea. Steam rose, soft and ghost-like in the pale morning light. Edward's words echoed in my mind. "Don't let love turn you into a debtor." The line rang so clearly it felt as if he were beside me again, nodding quietly, reminding me, "Don't go back, Susan." I picked up the phone once more and reread every message. My eyes lingered on the last one. "I'll lose everything." I typed slowly, each word deliberate. "Contact Ms. Alvarez, Community Debt Advisor." The message sent, simple, direct. No anger, no comfort, no pity. Just a rope thrown, not to pull him in, but to see if he'd take hold. Minutes passed, no reply. The screen stayed silent. I set the phone down, took a sip of tea, and let the mint dissolve slowly on my tongue. Warmth spread through my chest, then faded gently into quiet. I didn't know what Ryan would do, lash out, disappear, or finally face it. But for the first time, I knew that whatever came next, I would no longer return to the role of bearer. The tide within me had gone out. What remained was sand, and the faint footprints of a mother who had finally walked out of the deep water. Outside, the late sun glimmered on the roof, spilling into the kitchen window. On the wall, the back door key caught the light, glinting faintly, like a small punctuation mark at the end of a chapter. And as the afternoon dimmed, another message appeared, this time from Emily. "I'm sorry I can't make it this weekend. I just took on an evening class at the community center. A few middle-aged women want to learn personal accounting. I'm starting a small course to help them manage their finances the way you taught me." I read the message twice, smiling. No long speeches, no dramatic tone, just a few simple lines, and yet I could see it clearly. She, too, was being reborn. Once, Emily had always tucked herself behind the men in this house, behind Ryan, behind the illusion of a safe marriage. She once told me, her voice so small it nearly disappeared, "I feel like I'm living someone else's life, Susan." And now, through that short message, I could see a different woman, one who had found herself again. Not through defiance, but through knowledge, dignity, and the courage to teach what she once feared. I replied, "Do it, Emily. The world needs more people who know balance, not just endurance." She sent back a laughing emoji, followed by a photo. A small whiteboard with messy numbers and a cheap coffee cup beside it. It wasn't elegant, but it was warm. In the soft evening light, I realized that everything was changing, quietly, without spectacle, like the slow shifting of air before spring. I made tea as usual, but this time, it wasn't out of habit. I took down the old cup with the tiny crack along its rim, the one I'd hidden away because I couldn't bear to look at the wound. I set it on the saucer, poured the boiling water, and watched the steam curl, then fade. My hand didn't tremble. There was something simple yet vast in that feeling. Not fearing the spill, not dreading the break, not flinching from what can't be controlled. Just calm. The kind of calm one earns only after half a lifetime of storms. I carried the tea to the porch and sat in the wooden chair Edward once repaired. The sky was gray enough to promise rain, but it didn't fall. It just hung there, heavy and quiet, like a deep breath waiting to be exhaled. I looked up. Steam drifted across my face, dissolving into the cold air. And in that dim gray dusk, I realized my heart had turned green again. Not the bright green of youth, but the deep, steady green of a tree that's weathered many winds and still stands. I closed my eyes, listened to the wind brushing the porch, the ticking clock inside, my own steady breathing. Everything, it seemed, was returning to its rightful place. Emily with her new purpose, Ryan learning responsibility the hard way, and me, finally living my own life, no longer a shadow in anyone else's story. When I opened my eyes, the street lights had come on along the quiet road. Each light, small and soft, marked a kind of peace, steady, unshowy, but real. Maybe that was what I'd been searching for all along. A kind of light that doesn't need to dazzle, only to be true. I took a sip of tea, the mint spreading across my tongue, familiar yet new. The scent carried memories of other seasons, other lives, but tonight it didn't smell like the past. It smelled like evening, like now, like a woman who has fallen, endured, and still sits here, breathing, clear, and whole. I whispered, barely above a breath, "We're all learning to live again." And in that moment, I knew. If it rained tomorrow, I wouldn't hide under the roof anymore. I'd let myself get a little wet, feel the chill, then come back in, make tea, dry off, and hang the key in its place, like every other day. Because peace, I've learned, isn't about who stays. It's about having the courage to stay with yourself. The first wind of the season carried a strange chill in from the sea. That evening, as I was folding the tablecloth, the phone rang. Emily's number. Her voice trembled, caught between words and breath. "Susan, he's making me choose." I sat down, listening. Through the faint static, Ryan's voice echoed somewhere in the background, muffled, distant, like it came from a room filled with smoke. Choose her or me. 3 short words, heavy words. They fell like a stone tied to an old rope, pulling everything down again. I didn't hear a slap, no door slamming, just the sound of a grown boy trapped inside himself. A man who never learned how to love without possession. I exhaled slowly, steadying my voice. "Come home, Emily. Don't bring anything. Just bring your peace." About an hour later, headlights swept across the wall. Emily stepped inside, pale-faced, clutching a small bag. I didn't ask questions. We just looked at each other. One look. Enough to say everything words could not. I opened the spare room upstairs, the one Edward used to read in. Now it would be the room where someone else begins again. As she set her bag down, her voice shook softly. "I chose what's right." The words weren't loud, but they carried far. The quiet strength of someone who's endured too long and finally walks into the light, even with eyes still burning. She glanced around the room, awkward, as if she were borrowing a life. "I'll just stay for a little while, until I find somewhere else." I shook my head. "No need to rush. Stay. This room needs the sound of breathing more than it needs dust." She nodded and fell silent. I saw her lips press together, half gratitude, half fear of being a burden. Together, we tidied the room, wiped the table, changed the sheets, opened the window to let the wind in. Neither of us spoke, but every movement was gentle. The kind of gentleness people use when touching a wound that's almost healed. Later that night, as I came down to the kitchen, I heard water running upstairs, then the soft click of a door closing. A small, ordinary sound, but it warmed my heart. The house had voices again, no longer the sound of fear. There was a time when I was afraid of quiet nights, when the only sounds were the clock ticking and my own breathing. But tonight, the creak of the floorboards, the clink of glass as Emily poured water, the hush of a door closing, all of it felt like music. Not joyful music, but the kind that means life. I stood on the porch, watching the dark outside blend with the warm light spilling from the house. Shadows danced on the walls, across the table, and over the framed photo. Just Edward and me, still smiling. The wind was cold, but it didn't cut. It only brushed past, carrying the scent of something new, fragile, but real. On the wooden hook, the back door key still hung. It caught the light, shimmering softly, as if to remind me that while some doors close, others open, if only we dare. I poured more tea, the steam rising faintly like smoke. Sometimes breaking isn't the end, it's simply how the light finds a way in. It was late, yet the house still glowed. The scent of vegetable soup and toasted bread drifted through the kitchen, mingling with the soft rhythm of the knife on the cutting board and the whistle of boiling water. Emily was slicing onions while I rinsed vegetables at the sink. It was peaceful. Not the kind of peace that hides things, but the kind born when two people finally learn how to live with themselves again. I spoke without thinking, my voice soft, as though recalling something from long ago. You know, Ryan was afraid of the dark when he was little. Emily looked up, the knife still in her hand. I continued, washing the greens, my words falling like an old diary entry. Whenever the power went out, he'd run to my room, crawl under the blanket, and whisper, "Mom, the dark has a sound." I smiled, and he was right. Darkness does have a sound.
It's the sound of your own heartbeat when you're afraid of losing someone.
Emily set the knife down, meeting my eyes. Her voice was low, steady. Now his darkness is money. The sentence was simple, but it cut deep, into everything I hadn't yet named. I stopped what I was doing, watching the water run over the greens. Yes, Ryan's darkness wasn't in the room anymore. It was in him. In that place where fear and control had blurred into something he mistook for love. I looked at Emily. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both grief and compassion. Even hurt, she didn't hate him. Maybe that's why I admired her, because she still believed people could change. After a long pause, she said, "I don't know when he'll finally look at himself, but if he ever does, I won't hate him anymore." I nodded. That's the only thing I hope for, too. We set the table together. 2 bowls of hot soup, slices of bread, 2 glasses of water. Nothing fancy, but it was the first dinner in this house where no one had to be silent. No tiptoeing, no pretending, no playing the part of fine. Just 2 women, one older, one younger, sharing the quiet after the storm. Emily told me about her evening class. The students are wonderful. One woman, 60 years old, opened her first bank account last week. She said, "I finally realized money can be a friend, not a threat." I laughed softly. That sounds familiar. I suppose everyone who's feared something too long eventually has to learn how to befriend it. She smiled. I'm learning too. I looked at her. Tired eyes, yes, but with a small, steady light inside them. After dinner, I cleared the table while Emily washed the dishes. The sound of running water and clinking plates filled the air. A quiet rhythm, gentle as a lullaby. I glanced around the kitchen. This same kitchen that had witnessed shouting, tears, and silence too sharp to breathe through. Now it was the same space, the same wooden table, the same cracked teacup, but the fear was gone from the sound. When everything was clean, I walked over to the wooden hook where the back door key hung. The light from the ceiling hit it just right, and the metal gleamed. Not bright, not harsh, just a soft, breathing glow. I saw my own reflection in it, small but real. I touched it lightly, not enough to make it clink. I no longer needed that click to know I was in control. All I needed was the coolness against my fingertips, a quiet reminder that boundaries don't always need locks to stay intact. Behind me, Emily asked softly, "Do you think he'll come back?" I smiled. When a person hits the bottom, they learn to swim. And if they don't, then the bottom becomes the lesson. We both turned toward the window. Outside, the wind was gentle, the streetlights casting broken gold patterns on the glass. And in that moment, I felt it clearly. Some things are only born after the break, like trust, like stillness. like the light that finally fills a house once it stopped being afraid.
That night, the cold came earlier than usual.
The wind moved through the pines outside the porch, carrying the scent of damp earth and sea salt. I was stacking my journals on the table when I heard footsteps in the yard, unhurried, unhidden, heavy, like someone carrying the weight of himself. I tilted my head toward the window. Ryan stood there. He didn't knock. His shadow stretched across the steps, long and trembling under the pale porch light. His face was thinner, his coat hung unevenly, his shoes caked with mud. He looked like a man who had walked through a storm, not the kind that washes you clean, but the kind that makes you realize you've been soaked for far too long. I stayed still inside the house, the lights off. Between us was only a thin layer of wood, yet it felt like the span of a lifetime. Then his voice came, low and cracked. "Mom, I'm lost." Just 3 words, but within them I heard everything unsaid. Fatigue, regret, fear, and the faintest trace of hope. He wasn't angry anymore. No excuses, no blame. Just a son, standing outside his mother's door, shaking under the weight of his own mistakes. My hand rose to the latch, an old reflex, the kind that lives in the bones of every mother who once ran to open at the sound of her child crying. My fingers touched the cold metal. It would take only one turn, one click, and the door would open. I would see that face again, those eyes that had always been my undoing, that voice that once made me forgive even what I shouldn't. I almost did. Then I stopped. Not out of anger, not pride, but because for the first time in my life I understood. I can love him and still not save him. I leaned my forehead against the door and closed my eyes. Outside, the wind hissed through the cracks, rustling the dry leaves along the steps. Inside, the house was warm, still scented with mint tea. Between those 2 worlds, I stood, choosing neither, choosing stillness instead. His voice came again, smaller now. "I know you're angry. I deserve it. I just don't know what to do anymore." I didn't answer. Sometimes silence is the only language that helps a person finally hear their own. Across the room, the mirror caught my reflection. A 68-year-old woman with silver in her hair and tea stains on her hands. Not a saintly mother, not a triumphant survivor. Just someone tired of saving everyone but herself. I kept my hand on the latch, breathing slowly. Outside, the wind seemed to soften. Maybe Ryan was still there. Maybe he would leave. Either way, I knew that if this door ever opened again, it would have to open for both of us. Not so one could rescue the other, but so we could begin again as 2 people owning their choices. I stepped back. The tea on the table had gone cold, but its scent still lingered in the air. And then, gently, I spoke. Not loud, but enough for the words to reach through the wood. "Go home for tonight, Ryan. Come back when you're ready. Not with fear, but with the truth." I heard his breathing, sharp, uneven, then silence. No footsteps, no door closing. Just the sound of breath breaking apart, fading into the wind. I stood there a little longer, my hand still on the latch, then let it go. My hand was cold, but my heart was not. I don't know how long I stood before that door. Maybe a few minutes. Maybe half a lifetime. Outside, the wind shifted, stronger now. I heard the faint rustle of Ryan's jacket, then quiet. A tug rose inside me. The old pull to go out, the new strength to stay. Finally, I opened the door a crack. The yellow light from inside spilled onto his face, thinner, worn, hollow-eyed. He looked like someone who had just woken from a long, debt-heavy dream. one filled with self-deception. I stood on the threshold, not stepping out. We looked at each other, only a few feet apart, but with a lifetime between us. "You'll be all right," I said, my voice calm, steady. "If you start with the truth." No blame, no questions, no lecture, just a single sentence to reset the balance between us. He lowered his head, fingers twisting the hem of his coat. "I'm scared, Mom." I nodded. Whoever said we weren't allowed to be? The words came easily. Two people speaking from the same wound, owing nothing, just relearning how to breathe. I turned back into the house and opened a drawer. Inside was a small, creased note. Ms. Alvarez's phone number. The paper was wrinkled, its corner stained with tea, but the ink was still clear. I stepped out and handed it to him. "Start here," I said. Not a command, not advice, just a direction short enough not to block the rest of his road. Ryan took the note, his eyes red, his lips trembling, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. Maybe the word sorry hadn't yet found its shape, or maybe it hadn't found its way out. We stood there, me inside, him on the porch. Two different pools of light beneath the same roofline. From the living room came the sound of the clock striking midnight. Hour, minute, second. All hands meeting, then parting again. Just like two people bound by blood, breaking apart so they could learn how to find each other on their own feet. He drew in a deep breath. "I'll try. I can't promise anything, but I'll try." "That's enough," I said. "No one grows up overnight." He nodded, turned, and walked down the gravel path. His shadow shrank under the dim streetlight, each step scattering softly, uneven but real. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore, only the wind moving through the trees and the faint taste of salt from the distant sea. I closed the door. The hinges brushed against the frame, a thin sound that lingered like a sigh. Leaning back against the door, I let my arms fall to my sides. A wave of tiredness spread through me. Not heavy, just vast. Tears came, warm and clean, washing away the last trace of fear I had carried for years. I cried, but lightly, not from regret, but because I was finally free from the role of the mother who saves. I was just a mother, standing at the threshold of an ordinary night, learning how to let her child bear the weight of his own darkness. The kitchen light spilled softly through the door's narrow gap, painting a thin line of gold across the floor. On the wooden hook, the back door key hung quietly, glistening like a witness to every leaving and every return. I wiped my face, walked to the table, and poured myself another cup of mint tea. It had gone cold, but the scent was still sweet. I took a sip, sat down, and looked toward the door. Outside, I thought I heard Ryan's voice. "I'll try, Mom." But maybe it was just the wind. And the wind, tonight, was gentler than it had ever been. 3 months have passed since that night. Winter in New Jersey is melting away now, the snow retreating from the porch, leaving faint, wet trails across the wood. Every morning I make mint tea, open the kitchen window, and let the wind flow in. A breeze that carries both the salt of the sea and the warmth of early sun. In the mailbox, tucked between utility bills and insurance flyers, there's always one small, handwritten envelope. The same familiar slant, leaning right. R. Miller. Inside, not an apology, but a payment receipt. One each month, folded neatly, stamped by the bank. No letter, no note, just responsibility. Last week he sent a photograph, an empty room, freshly painted white walls, a single wooden chair, a notebook, and a small potted plant by the window. Beneath it, a short caption, "I'm learning to live alone." I read it slowly and set the photo beside my cup of still warm tea. No, Mom. No, I miss you. Just that one simple sentence, and yet it stilled my heart. Perhaps because it was honest. No decoration, no pretending. Only the quiet growth of something taking root inside him, like a green shoot pushing through cold soil. I stared at the picture for a long time. In that empty room of his, I imagined the small sounds. A ticking clock, the whistle of a kettle, the soft scrape of a chair. The details I once thought were just background noise to life. Now he was building his own background, no longer needing anyone else to frame it for him. That afternoon, a message came from Emily. She hasn't come by lately, but her tone was clear and calm. We've been talking every week with the counselor's schedule. No arguments, no blame, just learning to listen. I read it again and again. Every word carried the breath of someone tired but not giving up. No promises, no sweet coding, just honesty. Graceful, I thought. That word alone held its weight. I could see her journey inside those few lines, and mine as well. Stepping out of the old cycles, speaking less, listening more, placing faith not in grand gestures but in slow repair. That night, I sat at my table and opened the old brown leather notebook. On the first page, I once kept numbers, account balances, spending plans, to-do lists. Now I wrote different things, short, plain truths, like notes left for my future self. I wrote, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's ceasing to punish." I watched the ink soak slowly into the page. Forgiving doesn't mean pretending it never hurt. It means no longer using the past to bind someone, or yourself. I thought of Ryan, of Emily, of the nights I cried over the sting of betrayal. But as I wrote that line, the anger was gone. What remained felt like the air after a long storm. The ground still wet, but the thunder already far away. I closed the notebook and took a deep breath. The scent of paper, of tea, and of wind braided together. Familiar, yet new. Outside, the late sun slipped down the porch steps, washing the wooden door in gold. Inside, the house was quiet, but not empty. It was full of small things, the breath of tea, the rustle of paper, and the quiet faith that somewhere out there, someone I love is still trying. That evening, Betty dropped by, as she often does, carrying a bag of warm bread and that half-teasing, half-tender smile of hers. Betty set the bread on the table and took her usual seat by the window, the one where Edward used to read the paper every morning. The late sunlight slanted through the glass, washing her face in gold, softening the lines that time had carved into both of us. Two women, weathered, but still here. I poured her a cup of mint tea. She took it with both hands, looked around the kitchen, and smiled. "There's something different here, Susan." I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" She leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other, and glanced around the room like someone admiring a house freshly repainted. "The air. It's lighter now." I laughed. "Maybe because I cleaned out the closets and threw a few things away." Betty shook her head. "Not the things. You." She paused, then said something I'll never forget. "Your son is growing up for the second time." I froze for a moment. Maybe she was right. And maybe it wasn't just Ryan. Sometimes adults have to fall, break, lose before they can learn how to live kindly again. And perhaps I too was growing up for the second time, alongside my own child. I smiled. Yes, he's learning slowly but deeply this time. Betty took a sip of tea and closed her eyes as if to savor both the flavor and the silence. "Better late than never," she said softly. We sat there in the quiet, letting the afternoon light fill the kitchen. I glanced toward the wall, where the wooden hook held the familiar key. Sunlight fell across it, warming the metal. Not bright, not harsh, just a soft glow, the breath of a peaceful afternoon. I used to think I'd always be afraid of that click, that small sound that once began so many tearful conversations. Now, seeing it hang there, still and steady, I understood. It was no longer a symbol of boundaries. It had become one of balance. Betty stood, straightening her scarf before heading to the door. "Keep that key right where it is," she said. "It belongs here." I smiled. Yes, it belongs with me, too. After she left, the house settled back into its rhythm. The soft wind outside, the lingering scent of warm bread, the last shimmer of daylight like gold dust across the table. I was about to make another cup of tea when my phone lit up. A message from Ryan. "Coming by this weekend to fix the door." Just one line, no emoji, no period, but I read it over and over, as if it were a letter. I thought of the back door, the one that had once been a border between us, the one I'd leaned against while crying, the one he'd stood outside of, too afraid to knock. And now he wanted to fix it, not to come in, but to repair what he had once broken with his own hands. I sat back down, gazing out the window. The sky was pale blue, thin clouds drifting slowly by. I exhaled, long and full, a breath carrying everything at once: fatigue, pride, old pain, and quiet gratitude. There was nothing left to say, because sometimes a single act can speak for 1,000 words. I lifted my cup, brought it to my lips. The mint was just warm enough. Outside, the wind brushed against the door, a gentle reminder that every door can be mended if one learns not to slam it again. Saturday morning arrived with a strange, almost impossible blue, the kind of sky that looks freshly wiped clean after too many days of rain. I was wiping the table when I heard a car stop at the gate. A familiar sound, yet one that made my heart ache in a way I hadn't felt for months. Ryan came, carrying his father's old toolbox. The dark wooden box, worn at the corners, once belonged to Edward, his constant companion. Every time something broke, Edward would open it with both hands, like a ritual. Now that same box rested in my son's hands, the same son who once wanted to sell the house it came from. Ryan stood at the porch steps, silent. I opened the door, nodded in greeting, and stepped aside. Light fell across his face, thinner, older, gentler somehow. He didn't meet my eyes right away. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the rusty hinge, the metal squealing, the sound of the past being reopened. He bent over it, unhurried, as the old tools clinked together softly in the box. No orders, no words. Each nail, each turn of the screwdriver had its own rhythm, the rhythm of a man trying to tighten what had once come undone in his life. I stepped back into the kitchen and let him work. I brewed mint tea, as I always did on quiet mornings. The scent filled the house, washing over the smell of metal and dust. I didn't look out the window, but every sound from the porch, patient, awkward, painfully sincere, made my chest tighten. While I was pouring tea, Emily arrived. She stepped in with a nod, holding an apple pie from Betty, still warm. "Betty says that if a house smells like pie, no one can stay angry," she said with a small, almost shy smile. I laughed. She always knows how to make things softer. Emily glanced out the window and saw Ryan kneeling by the door, tightening a screw. The sunlight caught on his shoulders, showing the silver strands beginning to thread through his hair. She didn't say a word. She simply set the tray down and began helping me with the cups. A few minutes later, I heard the hinge give a quiet sound, not a creak this time, but a sigh. Ryan tested the door. It moved smoothly, easily. A small smile crossed his face. Not wide, not bright, but real. I carried the tray outside. He stood, wiping his hands on an old rag, glancing at me, then at Emily. And for the first time in a long while, the three of us, 3 lives once cracked open by anger and loss, sat around the same wooden table as if we'd never left it. Steam rose gently from the tea. The pie smelled of butter, cinnamon, and something sweeter. The scent of ordinary things no one had dared to touch in years. No one spoke. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, touching the table, the cups, our hair, making the dust shimmer like fine gold. The stillness felt so fragile I barely dared to breathe, afraid it might break. After so many storms, harsh words, and long nights of silence, the air now was clean, like the first morning after rain. I looked at the 2 people before me, my son and the woman he had once hurt. There were no sides anymore, no one to blame, no one to save. Just 3 people learning again how to sit together. Not to explain, not to apologize, simply to be present. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the gentle clink of a spoon against porcelain. The late afternoon light softened, laying a golden calm across each of our faces. No one mentioned the past. No one needed to. Outside, the faint tapping of a wrench carried through the air, steady, honest, like a song of repair played not for show, but for redemption. Ryan knelt again by the door, turned one last screw, and brushed his fingers across the hinge. He looked up at me and asked quietly, "Do you hear it?" I tilted my head. The door opened. No grind, no resistance, just a smooth, quiet exhale, like someone learning how to say, "I'm sorry," without words. Ryan began packing up, placing each tool carefully back into Edward's old wooden box. I stood nearby watching those hands, the same hands once used to sign contracts and tap on screens, now gripping wrenches and screwdrivers instead. Simple things, honest things. Each movement spoke louder than any apology could. The air in the house grew warmer, not from tea or sunlight, but from the easing of the space between the 3 of us. Emily sat still, her eyes soft. She turned her cup gently, letting the mint steam rise and fade. I knew she was learning to let go too, not to forgive just yet, but to stop biting down on the memory. Ryan wiped his forehead and sat across from me. He didn't look directly at me when he spoke, his voice low, careful, as if afraid to disturb what had finally settled. "Thank you," he said, "for not signing." I stayed quiet. There was no need to ask what. We both knew. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the door that now stood firm. "I'm grateful," I said softly, "that I didn't lose myself." He looked up, surprised. Maybe he expected me to say I forgive you or I understand. But forgiveness comes later. Understanding can wait. What matters first is knowing where we each stand, finally, clearly. A breeze swept through the room, nudging the curtains. The light shifted, and the shadows of the 3 of us fell across the floor, merging, then drifting apart like we once did, and somehow found our way back. Ryan reached for the key on the table and stared at it for a long moment. I stepped forward and placed it in his hand. "This door," I said slowly. "You once wanted to sell the whole house just to get away from it. Now try holding it. See if you can be responsible for something this small." He closed his fingers around it, not tight, just enough to feel the chill of the metal travel through his skin. Then he slipped it into the lock, turned it once, tested the hinge. The door opened, smooth, silent. He looked at me, as if asking, "What now?" I smiled, took the key from his hand, and hung it back on its wooden hook where it belonged. "It stays here," I said, "like me, like this house." Ryan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from understanding something, not winning it. He closed the toolbox and stood. Emily followed him to the door. They exchanged a small nod, not a promise, but an acknowledgement. Two people recognizing effort, not erasing pain. I remained in the kitchen, watching them through the doorway. The door stood firm. So did the boundary. No longer something to keep shut. Just something everyone finally knew how to respect. I placed my hand on the wooden hook, where the key swayed gently in the fading light. The metal caught the sun, muted gold, warm, steady. Not dazzling, just enough. And I thought, maybe peace begins when you no longer need to close the door to feel safe, but still know you have the right to, if you must. The wind drifted through again, carrying the scent of apple pie and mint tea. I exhaled, slowly. The breath of someone who has finally cleared the last of her old fear. A year had passed since the morning Ryan brought his father's old toolbox to fix the door. Winter had returned, softer this time. No cutting wind, just a chill that made you want to brew tea, light a candle, and remember what once frightened you. At the start of every month, I opened the mailbox, and, like clockwork, there it was. A small envelope with the name Ryan Miller written neatly among the clutter of bills and flyers. No letters, no notes. Just the receipt of another payment. The amounts were small but steady. Never late, never missed. I no longer counted the money. I counted the months of peace. Each receipt felt like a breath. Steady. Honest. Promising nothing except continuity. Sometimes I pictured him sitting in that small apartment of his, a wooden table, a kettle, a few green plants, pen in hand, light from a single lamp falling across his wrist. A simple gesture, perhaps. But I knew for him it was the only way to make amends, paying back not just the debt, but the recklessness that had once cost him his place in this house. Last week, Emily stopped by with a basket of golden oranges. She sat at the table, took off her coat, and said it almost casually, as if commenting on the weather. "We're seeing each other again. Slowly. There's counseling and rules about money." She smiled faintly. "Now we write everything down. Who pays for what? Who spends what? No guessing, no hiding. We're telling the truth this time." I froze for a moment. That truth was something they hadn't practiced in years. Not the comforting kind meant to soothe or convince, but the kind that hurts, just enough to build something real again. I poured her a cup of mint tea, the same scent that had punctuated every conversation in this kitchen, the scent that had outlasted anger, loss, and silence. "You know," Emily said, "our door doesn't stick anymore. Ryan oils it carefully. He says if there's one thing to learn from you, it's how to keep doors that know when to open and when to close." I smiled, clinking my cup gently against hers. "Doors are like people," I said. "If they listen to the wind, they'll know when to lock and when to let in the light." That afternoon, after she left, the kitchen held the faint scent of oranges and the soft sound of wind brushing through the curtains. I sat down at the table and opened my small notebook, the one for my new class. It's been a year since I started teaching knitting and budgeting for older women at the community center. The first session had 5 people. Now, there are more than 20. We knit scarves, sweaters, and fabric bags, while talking about life, about small sums of money, about how not to be fooled by guilt or love disguised as duty. I tell them, money isn't bad. It just tests the heart. The room always fills with laughter, warm, knowing laughter. One woman said, "My heart's exhausted from all the tests." Another replied, "At least we still have a heart to test." We all laughed together. Each of them had once been drained by children, by husbands, by invisible expectations. But today, they sat there, needles clicking, yarn sliding through their fingers, knowing exactly what they wanted to keep for themselves. At the end of every class, I collected their small fees, modest, but freely given. I put the coins in a tin box, closed the lid, and turned the key. That click, the same sound that once made me flinch, now made me feel safe. I've learned that some doors don't need to be opened by anyone else. They only need someone strong enough to turn the key from within. By late afternoon, the sun slanted through the kitchen window, thin and gold, like the last veil of winter. On the wall, the key still hung where it always had. No one touched it anymore, but whenever the wind moved through the room, it made a soft sound, round, steady, warm. Not the sound of an object, but of presence. The sound of a past finally at rest, the sound of a boundary that no longer hurts. I poured myself a final cup of tea and sat down, flipping through the first pages of my notebook. Between the lists of expenses and reminders, I found the sentences I'd once written for myself. Don't use kindness to cover someone else's mistakes. Don't let love turn into debt. I touched the tip of my pen to the page, then set it down. There was nothing more to add. Everything I needed to say already lived in the air, in the light, in the simple act of still being here. On the table sat the small recorder Emily had given me for my birthday. "You tell stories beautifully," she'd said. "Record your voice, so when someone needs to listen, they'll know how brave you once were." I pressed the button. A soft click filled the room. I looked straight at the key hanging on the wall and spoke slowly, each word landing like a heartbeat. "Loving you doesn't mean funding you." Then I stopped, letting the silence settle between the words. Outside, the wind moved gently. I could hear my own voice echo in the kitchen, not angry, not cold, just true. I continued, quieter now, almost to myself. "I haven't forgiven you yet. I've just stopped punishing you. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is." And in that moment, I understood. Forgiveness isn't reopening the door to let someone back in. It's stepping away from the door. It's trusting that if they once hurt you, they're now learning how to live with their own darkness. I pressed stop, set the recorder down on the table. The kitchen grew dim. The light from the window narrowed into a single streak across the floor, reaching the leg of the table before fading away. I took a deep breath, felt my lungs rise, then release. It felt like the end of a long journey, one I could finally turn and look back on without fear. I opened the window. The smell of the sea drifted in, sharp and soft at once. Waves in the distance, wind through the pines. The faint creak of the back door, all blending together, the house speaking in its own quiet language. I looked up. The sky had turned a soft gray blue, and the thin moon of a new month hung just above the clouds. I thought of Edward, the man who'd been gone 10 years now, the one who once guarded this door, the one who first taught me that love was never meant to be a burden. I smiled. "You see," I whispered, "I finally learned how to stand still, without fear." The wind brushed the key and it chimed once, a clear, tender ting, small but resonant. For a moment, I could almost hear Edward laugh, low, warm, and far away. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and left the door slightly open. Outside, the tide moved in rhythm. Inside, the house rested. And within me, nothing left unsaid.
Now the door is still. When the wind passes through, the key only hums, no longer the sound of fear, but the gentle note of a house that has healed. I've learned that love isn't about saving someone. It's about letting them learn to stand. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If it touched you, leave a comment. Tell me, when was the last time you forgave someone? And don't forget to subscribe so we can keep meeting here, day after day, to listen to another true story, where every crack still holds a chance for light to come through.